Welcome back. This is now session 2 of Youth Marginalisation and its Impact on Communities. My name is Craig Pinkney and I'm going to be taking you through the last and final session of this unit. So one of the things I just want to do is just kind of recap what we covered in the first session, session number 1. So if you remember, we started to look at the process of marginalisation and its impact on young people. And then we kind of started to look at and explore and seek to understand the impact of marginalisation on young people. And what I will do is kind of make references in a moment in relation to some of the things that we covered in session 1, just to kind of rejig your memory and get us to thinking again, get us to get the cogs turning in our minds about some of the things that we explored. So we looked at the process, then we also looked at the adverse impact, and then we started to also focus on, effective ways that we can think about reducing issues of marginalisation or alienation amongst young people. And you'll remember that I framed the point that you need to think about things within your context. I gave you a number of examples of here in the UK within a British context, but wanted you all to think about some of the issues as it relates to the process, the impact of marginalisation, and where do you fit in terms of your context about reducing some of those issues that may be impacting children, young people, and their families or the wider community. So today's session, we're going to be looking at the impact on community, because I think it's important that we not just only talk about young people and the impact of marginalisation, alienation, and so on and so forth, but what is the wider impact? What is the adverse impact that has on communities? And I think secondly, it's important that we kind of look at some kind of structural, institutional aspects as well. You heard me mention and allude to some of these ideas yesterday when we were mentioning equality, fairness, and other topics and terminologies, but we are going to be looking at the principles of equity, equality, and oppression. And I'm going to make reference to some of the theoretical underpinnings that we used yesterday, but also I'm going to highlight a few new ones that, again, that we can utilize in discussion to get us to think about some of the key things that we are going to be focusing on today. So if you remember yesterday, we were looking at the factors. Again, we were looking at the process, which links to the factors of marginalisation and getting you to think about some of the key things that lead. And if you remember, we discussed the notion of poverty and the adverse impact poverty has, and also how poverty can create those environments for young people to feel marginalised or alienated. We touched on depression. Deprivation, a correction. So we looked at deprivation, we looked at poor education, the impact of dysfunctional families, and we looked at domestic violence and the impact of that may have on children and young people. Also issues around abuse, whether that is sexual, emotional, all of those things can have an impact on children and young people. Employment, or high unemployment within particular communities, the lack of resources, poor housing conditions, the impact of racism. You heard me mention structural as well as institutionalized racism, impact of trauma. You heard me talk about around the contemporary literature and data that's talking about children and young people that live within environments that they may deem or perceive to be dangerous, to be violent, and maybe that may be a reflection of local police statistics, local data. You may hold data within your organizations on hotspot areas where there may be issues amongst young people, and what the impact is on those children and young people in those communities. And we were also talking about, if you remember, the idea about primary trauma, also vicarious trauma, meaning individuals that may be primary, may be involved or see situations, scenarios within their environment, and as a consequence of that become quite traumatized. And then it's important to understand vicarious trauma as it relates to young people that may live in a particular community and they hear constant stories and narratives, whether that is from their peers, whether that's within the TV, whether that's from their parents, whether that's within education at school. Their teachers tell them about things to be aware of, and as a consequence of that, children can become quite traumatized based on those particular things. And that led on to some of the research that I was alluding to yesterday around fear. And I think it's important that we have these kind of contemporary discussions about fear and the impact of fear on children and young people. One of the other things I was speaking about, if you remember at the beginning of session 1, I was talking about reactive interventions. And what was I alluding to? That we as professionals, one of the things that is important that we acknowledge, it's not just about having passion. You heard me speaking about passion, and many of us are very passionate about working with children, young people within our communities. But I also mentioned intellect and having the knowledge to be able to utilize the contemporary understanding of how young people, children view the world, and utilize that knowledge based on research, based on frontline experiences that we have, and we kind of connect that to a space where we can create strategies to reduce that alienation and marginalization amongst young people. Which also then linked to a second point. If you remember, I spoke about staff competency. Do we have the skills? Do we have the qualities to be able to do all of the things that we have discussed, considered, within our organizations and the things that we do? What are the skill deficits? Have we ever as organizations sat down and had a true reflection of what we can do versus what we can't do? What do we need to enhance in terms of our skills? Do we need to build our communication skills? Do we need to become more familiar with the issues that are impacting young people, whether that's to do with mental health, homelessness, trauma, whether that's to do with violence, and so on and so forth? Are we aware? Are we competent to be able to do the job? And then the thing that also links to some of the other wider factors, which we mentioned. So we spoke about the impact of limited policing within particular communities, also damaged relations between the police and the community. I'm sure you're fully aware of those issues. We mentioned the idea around poor leadership and the impact that poor leadership can have in specific communities. And then we've ended with the conversation about COVID-19. If you remember, I was talking about we have a global pandemic, and whether or not that COVID-19, the cases of COVID-19 may not necessarily be an issue in your particular context, but from a global perspective, when we're talking about the economies, nationally, globally, when we're talking about politics, nationally and globally, COVID-19, we can agree, has had definitely an adverse impact on the way that things are today in society. And the ripple effect of that is how we mobilize, move, and the limitations that we may have ultimately socially within that. And I think it's important that we kind of acknowledge some of the external things that are happening globally, because we kind of can get a better understanding of almost like the pecking order of how things may impact one institution, one organization, one political party to another, and what that may look like for the communities that are oftentimes on the receiving end of all of these particular changes in this current climate. So just to kind of reinforce the point that I've just made, that when we're talking about the idea of marginalization, we're talking at 3 different levels or 3 different categories that we can view it. So we can't just only focus on marginalization that exists socially with some of the factors that I've just mentioned. We have to also understand the concept of the economy and the impact of finance and wealth, and the pulling of particular wealth and finance in particular spaces, regardless of wherever the context may be, and what is the adverse impact that has on, communities, families, young people, children, and the institutions that ultimately govern that. And then we've got the political marginalization there. We're talking about decision making, and oftentimes those decisions that are made sometimes by poor leaders. And again, we see and hear about all of the confusion and the conflicts that also exist as a consequence of that poor leadership and that bad decision making. So then we started to talk about the impact, and what are the effects of marginalization. And I utilized a UK perspective, if you remember, to get you to think about some of the issues again in your context. So these are the things that are an issue here within the UK. So we've got a major issue amongst street gangs, where young people are joining groups based on the notion of postcodes or geographical locations. And as a consequence of that, whether they're fighting for power, whether they're fighting for reputation, respect, so so on and so forth, what we're seeing amongst our young people is that they're in conflict and they're utilizing weapons. You heard me use the term like knife crime is a term that we use here within the UK. They use guns. I know in places like America and other places they use the word gun violence. We tend not to use that terminology here, but it means ultimately the same thing. Whether knives or guns, young people that are in street gangs are involved in conflict for a number of reasons. And we're seeing the spike in violence, and we're seeing the number of fatalities within the UK increase, and more specifically within COVID-19. I also alluded to the fact around radicalization and extremism, because sometimes when we have conversations about young people becoming violent or young people that are involved in criminality, we only tend to focus on only one category of young people, like I've just mentioned, young people that are in street gangs. However, it's important to understand and highlight, again, from a British context, we have a rising far-right extremism, where you have racist groups that follow a particular ideology around white nationalism, and we oftentimes hear about and see conflicts that exist within particular communities because white people within British society feel marginalized, they feel unseen and unheard. And then on the other side of the coin, which you heard me also mention last week, was also talking about you have religious extremism. So like how you have far-right extremism, you've got religious extremism, where individuals are using whether biblical, Quranic, or whatever text that they want to use as scripture to justify some of the behaviors that they claim is from God. And within the particular vicinity in which they want to make those particular changes based on what they believe. We see and we hear a lot of the conflicts and also things like terrorist attacks that we have in our country. So it's important that when we're looking at the wider scope of radicalization, we can see that when communities feel marginalized, whether that is the South Asian communities, the Arab communities within our country, or the Muslim communities within the country, we see how that happens on one side of the coin. And then you may have white communities that may be the predominant number within here in the UK, but they now feel marginalized when we see migration, people immigrating, refugees are coming from different spaces throughout the world, and through their lens, they feel quite marginalized. And in context of the top three, we then see people do things as a consequence or an impact from that process of marginalization. And then we also mentioned drugs and alcohol and substance misuse and the selling of these particular substances predominantly by young people. Exploitation of young women and young boys. So prostitution has also been on an increase. And in a European context, there's been a major issue amongst human trafficking, where young women, young males are being trafficked from different spaces throughout Europe in order for particular organized criminal groups to make finance from selling human beings within the sex industry. So again, just to reinforce the point, part of your discussions that you need to be having amongst your groups is within your context, where does this conversation fit? Where and how, through the processes of marginalization and alienation, what are some of the common denominators, or are they similar to the things that I've just mentioned and are showing on the screen? Are there similarities with some of the things that I'm projecting here as a point? Some of them may be similar. You may have even different forms of effects of marginalization as a consequence of some of the issues that we discussed from session one. And if you remember, we then focused on the cycle, what I said in my analysis from my research, and a lot of us that work closely here in the UK, we agree ultimately that there's a cycle, that we see children and young people almost like in a conveyor belt, where they move from one space to another, and then that other space leads them to somewhere else, and then leads them to somewhere else. But then ultimately at some point in time, that cycle starts again. So when we think about all of the factors in which I've just mentioned, regardless of the context, We're talking about young people feeling alienated and marginalized, but live within a community or a society that oftentimes is disorganized. And we explained the concept of social disorganization, if you remember in the first session, but ideally talking about the entities, the institutions that govern that particular community, that they lack the connectivity, the ideas, the strategies as a collective, not as individual organizations, to respond and to keep our children safe and to reduce the issues of alienation and marginalizations. And then you heard me mention that criminal mindsets exploit that fact. And when we look at all of the vices in which our children and young people engage in, they exploit that particular fact for a range of different reasons. So them young people trying to navigate throughout life, throughout their community, throughout their society, involve themselves in these particular groups that are oftentimes linked to forms of criminality, and then they engage in this particular criminality, and then as the state, as organizations, and the genuine consensus oftentimes is the only way that we respond to these issues is generally through a punitive measure. And that punitive measure oftentimes ends up with juvenile facilities, youth offender institutions, which we call it here in the UK, mental health institutions, secure units for children under 16 years old, and so on and so forth. But then the cycle starts again. So just to kind of reiterate the point, one of the things I want you all to think about and consider within your context, how does this model fit? What do you see in terms of the common denominators with children and young people, male and female, that may be marginalized? And then what happens as a consequence of that marginalization within that cycle, within that conveyor belt? And then I also provided you with a challenge, if you remember in the first session. So when we are looking at this particular model, I said to you all, you should be asking the question, where do we fit? Which links to the learning outcome around knowing ways or having an understanding of how we can reduce marginalization. And you heard me say one of our strongest points is how we turn from social disorganization to organization. And one of the conversations you need to be having amongst your groups is, what does that organization look like? What are the holistic things that we need to do? If we're talking about multi-agency working, how do those multi-agencies work? So I can give you an example of here within the UK. One of the things that we do when we're talking about failure is that, let's say, for example, a 14-year-old has been killed as a consequence of gun violence here within the UK. There's been a shooting, a fatality. Oftentimes what happens is there's normally kind of a roundtable discussion about what went wrong. And there's normally what is called a serious case review, where a third party will investigate what they think has happened. And one of the common things that generally comes up in conclusion when these reviews are written is that there was a lack or a breakdown of communication, where you have a number of organizations that may be doing brilliant work, but because they haven't communicated, because they haven't shared the right information about this child, about the work that these organizations are doing with these children, these young people are in a space where so many multiple professionals and organizations may be working with them. Due to that failure of communication, an organization may have missed an opportunity to engage with that child, to maybe provide or inject or utilize something in terms of an intervention that may have been useful to reducing the situation where they could have been safe. And as a consequence of that, oftentimes professionals are blamed for that and oftentimes held accountable. So we can take learning from these particular examples to think about and consider, where do we go wrong? What are our strengths and our weaknesses? And what can we do great? And what can we do really well? And I think learning from that, I want you to think about in your context, where have things gone wrong? Think about, the last situation where unfortunately a young man or a young woman in your local community has been taken to violence. Think about in your context where a young woman or a young male has been sexually abused. Think about it in your context where there's somebody that may have been harmed in a range of different ways within your context, and utilize this model to think about what could have ultimately been done better, and how do young people arrive from one space to another, and what we can do as organizations to ultimately reduce that. And I think one of the things to just kind of highlight, again, just to kind of reinforce some of the conversation that we've previously had, is to kind of look at some of the challenges that are faced by our children and young people. And I wouldn't say this is exclusive to the UK. I would say that it's also global. We're talking about issues around poverty and homelessness. We've mentioned already around mental health, trauma, abuse, the impact and the failure of an education system, and I would say education systems, lack of opportunities when we're talking about unemployment, the access to appropriate and competent, the word competent comes in again, support services. We're also talking about bullying, victimization of young people, and that may be in school, that may be within their areas in which they live. Bullying is a major issue amongst young people. Substance misuse is an issue. We've mentioned already around the structural racism and institutional racism, but this idea about young people feeling isolated or neglected. And I think when we talk about isolation, especially when we're talking about in the pandemic where buildings are being closed and the movement of children and young people are somewhat being limited, the term isolation fits. Pornography is also a major issue, and this is not just something that is been documented through the research within the UK context, but globally. Again, you heard me say in the first session, social media, the impact of social media. We're now in a mediatized world where young people can get information literally by a click of a button. They're using tablets, they're using smartphones, and there's so many different platforms that young people can use to engage. Pornography is definitely something that is a major challenge amongst our young people. We've mentioned knife and gun violence already, but I think the culture of fear, which I think also links to a previous point around trauma, anger, it's a major issue. How do we get children and young people to recognize their anger, and also to manage and to build resilience, and get them to think about how they can have strategies to manage their anger. So again, one of the things I'm doing whilst I'm talking is getting you all to consider and think about what are ways that we can reduce marginalization, alienation amongst young people. And a lot of that is through the things that we understand and also the things that we do. Exploitation, you've heard me say, I'm not going to go through every single one, but I think one of the key things I think we can recognize, especially to the point that I just made about social media and the usage of social media amongst our children and young people, is this idea about materialism. And we can't ignore that we live in capitalist societies, or governed by a lot of capitalist societies that project this particular image and this narrative that children and young people need to have all of the latest things, the latest clothing, the latest designer brands, the latest cars, the latest watches, the latest handbags. And whilst these projection of marketing campaigns from multinational corporations, what is the adverse impact on our young people? What does that have on young people when they feel that they can't afford and they can't achieve some of the things that are being projected and advertised to them? We then can think about the effects of marginalization. If the projection of material goods are being projected at them, and that's the process, what is the impact? What is the effect of those particular images and videos towards young people, or marketed towards young people, when they know they may not have the finance to be able to get it? And what do we see? And then you've heard me also mention social media again, but I think music, gaming, films, I think also needs to be part of your discussions when you're thinking about, how do young people get to that space of some of the issues that we see within our society.